Now is a great time to be joining a Dynasty Startup Draft. So, Zach and I are here to present you with our strategies and what we focus on when we're in a Dynasty Startup Draft. In my opinion, two of the best people I know at doing a Dynasty Startup Draft. I know I'm a little biased, but with all that said, I do hope you all enjoy the video. Please leave a like if you do. Comment down below your startup draft strategies in the comments below. But with all that said, let's get right to it. So we are talking some Dynasty Startup Draft Strategy today, and I got Zach with me. I think I finally met my match when it comes to startup draft strategy, because I've always thought I was pretty good. We actually did a startup draft together with our patrons, and I thought between the two of us, we both nailed the startup draft, set up our teams for the long term. And I think we did a really good job, maneuvering the draft board really well. So I wanted to get you in on this, especially right off the bat. I'm just going to dive into some basic notes, things you need to know about your league and stuff like that. Know your league scoring, know everything about your league that you can. Scoring, format, required starters, bench, taxi squad, IR size, any rule that is about that league, know it, because I've seen too many people go into drafts when it's a super flex league and they go back to back RB and they're like, where are you guys drafting all these quarterbacks?
I think you hit all the ones there. Know how many rounds your draft is. That could
Sure.
help too. And know what other drafts have looked like before you go into your startup draft. So if you're doing a startup draft, watch a Dynasty Rewind startup draft that we may have done in the past week or 2 weeks to see where players are falling, because you could capitalize on somebody else wanting the value. The reason why Bob picked me is because we are very similar in our strategy in the startup drafts, which is try to acquire future draft capital as well as building a competitive team. So knowing the market is really important. Knowing if somebody you're drafting at 202 is somebody that is going in startup drafts at the end of the third round is very important. Especially know the first few rounds and know the market and value, because whatever format you may be on, the ADP may not be set right, which is really important. It's really important. So just do as much homework as you possibly can.
If you prep for an hour, you're probably well ahead of anybody who is coming into that draft, because there's a lot of times startup drafts are very, very impromptu. There's not a lot of like, hey, let's do a startup draft and start 2 months from now. Like, no, if we're starting and doing a startup draft, we're starting tomorrow. But required starters is probably a huge one for me, especially nowadays when the starting formats are so wildly different from league to league, between whether even being super flex versus non, 2 tight end is becoming a thing, 3 wide receiver, 3 flex, where you can flex wide receiver, running back, or tight end, very much becoming a thing. Obviously, things like that are going to increase scarcity on certain positions. So something very much to pay attention to. And then bench, obviously important, just because you want to know how many players you can stack on your bench. Don't accrue 50 picks if you're going to have to cut 20 of them right after the draft, things like that. Taxi squad, how many guys can you stash? Stuff like that. And you don't want to be that guy who is like, oh, I didn't know it was like that. Nobody's going to like you. I'm sorry.
Right.
Does the draft spot impact your draft strategy, Zach?
No, I don't think so. You and I have been going back in terms of our specific leagues, rookie drafts. I did a rookie draft today where I've made 6 trades today. I've made 1 draft pick. We're at the end of the third round. I'm always trying to acquire future capital, not because I believe in the future capital, but because other people believe in it. And you can capitalize on that FOMO, because FOMO is a real thing. Fear of missing out is a real thing. People love the unknown. And I'll capitalize on that. I'll trade a first round pick next year if it makes my team better. If I win 1 fantasy championship, I've paid off my fantasy dues for the next decade. I will capitalize on people's FOMO in a startup draft of, I gotta have Cam Akers. I gotta have J.K. Dobbins. I gotta have Justin Jefferson. I believe, Bob, both you and I in our startup draft a few weeks ago traded. I think you traded either down or out of the first round completely.
I traded down.
I tried to. I had the 102. Everybody was asleep. I took Jonathan Taylor. No problem with me whatsoever. And then I traded my second round pick, got a first round pick next year, and I think a third round pick in the startup draft. So, no, my position never changes. I'm always trying to acquire future capital. In a startup draft, though, I'm never trying to just punt on that upcoming year. Like I still fully believe that you and I built very competitive teams, and
Yep.
still set ourselves up very nicely to either draft next year or use that capital in trades to help out our team. So no, I'm always trying to. I mean, that was the butt of the joke in our startup draft. Like, oh, Zach's on the clock again. What do you want for this pick? So I mean,
Yeah, you and me both.
yeah, yeah. So, but you did it much more discreetly than I did. I was like, hey, come get
Yeah.
this pick. Come get this pick. I'll put the pick straight up on the on the block.
Yeah.
I don't care. It's not
Yeah.
going to devalue it for me. Like, you're not going to give me
Yeah.
less value. I'll just make a pick. So no, I it doesn't change my strategy. I'm typically trying to capitalize on other people's FOMO.
It doesn't impact my draft strategy at all, because especially by the time I'm done maneuvering around the board, I probably don't even have the same draft slot I had before. This draft, I was crazy all over the board. It was one of my favorite drafts I think I've ever done in terms of just maneuvering the draft board, I think, really beautifully. But it doesn't impact for me at all. I would like a higher draft slot. I think I had the third pick. In this one, I traded down to pick 9, and it's like a super tight end premium. So it's like plus 1.5 for a tight end reception. So I drafted Kyle Pitts early, and then I didn't make another pick, I think, till like the end of the third round. And I just kept trading down. I think I traded twice in the second round. And that was something I thought was dead in startups. Like, I thought people were done trading up in startups, and it's still very much a thing. Kind of touching on overall draft strategy, I always want to trade down. If I'm trading up, it's maybe a couple picks, but there are people that want to trade up like a whole round. And that's where you really can soak up value. That's where you get like first round picks off teams. And that's where you can really still accrue a ton of value. And if you can get like a bonus top 10 startup draft pick, man, you're going to set your team up crazy. Like, I think we did a pretty good job of, like I mentioned, and we'll probably keep mentioning. I don't like to trade up. I think I did it once in this one. I think it was to acquire Jahan Dotson, which now kind of a meh pick, but I think I gave up like a third round next year. So I'm like, whatever.
My draft strategy trading back is you got to give me a pick later in this draft and a pick in the draft next year, which is the Bob thing to do. You give me 2 for 1. And so I ended up, after the 11th or 12th round, I had 14 picks. I had 14 players on my team, and I had another first round pick and a second round pick in next year's draft.
I had the same method. I drafted 15 players in the first 10 rounds, and that was through trading down. I acquired 2 2023 firsts. I acquired 2 additional 2023 seconds and a 23 third. And I even started getting picks in the 24 draft. So, I mean, it was one of those things where it's like I was moving down a round at a time, not even a round at a time, like to the back end of the round. And then sometimes I'd move back again. It was one of those things where if I had a pick now and somebody who was coming at me with a pick, and there was somebody I liked 6 picks down the board, if I had 6 people I liked at this pick and I was comfortable getting at the next pick, see ya, I'm at the next pick. Give me whatever value I can get. It's just a great way to accrue draft capital. And, we touched on it a little bit already. I'm never the punt right away type person. I'm always, I want to try to target as much youth as I can early, youth that's going to be very high end starter early. And then later I'll soak up some value on veterans, trade down to acquire draft capital later, and stack picks in the top 10 rounds. Figure your top 10 rounds are your starters. And in a deep league like that one is, the more starting quality players you have, that's which are pretty much the players that can consist in the first 10 rounds, the more players like that you have that you can slot into your starting lineup through bye weeks, injuries, things like that, you're going to wipe the rest of the league. And the one thing with this is some things I noticed with some teams that I think are going to struggle is once we hit that 10 round mark, they had 7 or 8 players drafted because they put a lot of stock into high-end draft capital. At least early, the thing is what I'm going to struggle with eventually is I'm going to have a lot of like wide receiver 2, RB2 that are high-end, but I'm not going to have a lot of elite talent unless I cash in on these early 2023 picks. If I get 1 or 2 guys in the next 2 drafts, next three players in the next 2 drafts, I'm not going to be worried at all. I'm always looking to compete in some capacity, whether it's not for sure championship. Hey, if I can make the playoffs, anything can happen. I think there are teams that are a little fraudulent that make the playoffs, but all it takes is getting hot, and I've experienced this. I've been the 1 seed how many times, and I just have a bad week one of the playoffs and I just get knocked out by the 6th seed just because my team didn't show up and there's decided to be a buzzsaw that week. One thing that I always see is when you're trying to fill out your starting roster or your team, are you kind of always drafting best player available? Or are you more so drafting for need or versus the value?
It's hard to do best player available in a startup draft the first 10 rounds. Then you can do best player available because you do need to fill certain spots. And it's the same thing in a rookie draft. I would say first 4 or 5 picks in a rookie draft, if you're there, you should pick for a need. Unless it's a need that just the value does not fit whatsoever. Like if you need a quarterback in a 1 quarterback league, you can get Kenny Pickett in the end of the 2nd round. Don't be drafting Kenny Pickett at the end of the 1st round in a 1 quarterback league. Nobody else is I can tell you in my rookie draft today, I think Kenny Pickett went late second round. My first 10 picks in a startup draft, I'm just, I'm trying to fill my roster the best I can. You're going to have it depending on what the roster format is, super flex, tight end premium. You're going to have to take some of those. May not be the best player available at that point. And then at a certain point, you do go best player available unless you need another quarterback or unless you need another tight end. I know that there's something to be said about going and getting your guy. Identify players you want to get, but know where to get them. Don't overreach. Today in my rookie draft, Romeo Doubs went 202. Don't do that. That's a huge mistake. You can get Romeo Doubs in our mock drafts. He went 401. You can get Romeo Doubs at the end of the 3rd round and get somebody else at 202 that presents more value. And if you miss on Romeo Doubs, you'll live.
I actually kind of go the other way with that conversation. I typically tend to draft best player available or who I feel is best player available throughout the draft until like the end where I'm like, okay, I need a little more depth here. But I'm not usually, and this might just be dumb luck that I just happen to kind of fill as I go along, where all the pieces are kind of falling into place. But for the most part, I stick the best player available, figure out need later and trade for it, or, draft dart throws, when I need them. Later in the drafts, I kind of mix need with best player available at the position, unless somebody's wildly better at another position that I'm already stocked on. If I can have 6 starting wide receivers that are better than my RB2, I'm okay with that. I know it's a weird kind of concept. I've actually had a lot of success with the anchor running back method where I just have one really good running back and the other ones are just kind of probably flex plays at best. And then I load up on wide receiver. Running backs can be super, make or break for a team, but that's just where I've had a lot of success. So I don't necessarily feel the need to fill that void with somebody who's like an RB3, but slotting into my RB2 because I need him. Another thing, like I said, stacking picks in the top 10 rounds, such a huge strategy. As many picks as you can get in that top 10. Obviously, you don't want to just draft like all of your picks in the top 10 or in like round 10. Don't do that. But like if you can get an additional 2nd round pick, an additional 3rd round pick, an additional 4th round pick, an additional 5th round pick, and then turn some of those rounds into 3 picks per round, you're going to be rolling in picks before you know what to do with yourself with, because that's how you get to be, like I said, Zach, you had 14 after the first 10 or 11 rounds. I had 15 after the first 10 or 11 rounds, and I'm still loaded for next year with draft capital.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think we both have pretty competitive teams, I think you went with a lot more rookies than I did, which was fine. I don't have any issue with it. I decided on younger established veterans. The hard thing, I think really hard, is assessing trade value. And this is in terms of like startup picks versus rookie picks, and then also how to maneuver up or down in trades. But when I'm trying to move down, so I have a point A and a point B with my startup picks here. So now I need something to bridge that gap. So let's say to get from the start of round 2 to the start of round 3, I want at least a 23 first or a next year first, whatever it is. And then I'm probably trying to snag like a 7th round startup pick. And that's how you stack picks. I mean, I would never send that to somebody and be like, hey, take my, all my picks. But these are picks that have happened. These are real life picks that people are making to maneuver up the board to go get their guy, to not miss out on that great wide receiver option, that great running back option. And that's just, to me, just blows my mind. Something that people always make the mistake of is with rookie picks, like a 23 first is not equivalent to a startup pick first. A 23 first is more so equivalent to like a 6th or 7th round startup pick. And that just kind of depends on the year. Next year, it'll probably be worth a little more than normal. I think those picks are going to get a little inflated, but it's still one of those things where you need to pick a point A where you're starting at, and then a point B, bridge the gap between those two one way or another. And I think the best way to do that, moving up, like I said, moving up, I'm not moving up around because I'm not going to be comfortable giving up what I'm giving up. I don't want to give up a next year first and a startup pick in the 7th round. Essentially, by that math, you gave them 2 firsts to pivot around. Not for me, man. I want nothing to do with it. If I'm moving up in a startup, it's a few picks and I'm sending like a 3rd round pick to bridge the gap. And it's a 3-piece trade. It's point A, it's point B, it's the bridge. And that's how I'm moving. A great way to do this is, instead of putting picks to the value, put names to the picks and then assess from there, because that's a lot easier. People are more familiar with things like that. Let's say you're moving from Javonte Williams to J.K. Dobbins, players that are about a round and a half to 2 rounds apart in a startup. Are you willing to play a 23 first, 23 firsts to make that move from JK to Javonte? I'm not. That's a Bijan Robinson and a Jackson Smith and Jigba. Hashtag Devi. But
yeah.
it's go ahead, Zach.
No, it's I agree with you. I'm not a big trade up person. I will trade up a few spots if I have a pick coming up, and I will use that pick as leverage and offer something else later in the draft, or a 3rd or 4th round pick, or I'm even like I'll use a little bit of fab if I have to get that deal done. But I'm not I will trade up and give you a 1st round pick. I'm that's not my style at all.
Yeah.
I think, and that's the thing. I that's why you recruited me to do this videos, because we have that similar mindset. And there's a way to do it right where you are competitive and you're a young team and you have that's the trifecta there, right?
It's a dream.
You're competing for the playoffs. You're a young team at most positions. Like, I had to draft Russell Wilson at quarterback. I'm okay with that. He still got 5-6 years left at the quarterback position. I'm not mad at that, And I also have picks next year to give me flexibility either in the draft or trading for other pieces in the offseason.
Another thing that's an auto reject for me is if somebody's throwing more than 4 or 5 assets. 6 is probably where I max out. If anybody's throwing more than 6 assets in a trade, reject, because don't give me the trade calculator, because there's no way that value equates ever in that deal. If you're moving more than 10 pieces, there's no way to assess that value. And if anything, probably somebody's trying to sneak like a 23 first in there, so you won't see it because there's just a mess of picks and everything going on with that. So that's an auto reject. But like I said, putting names to picks instead of just looking at picks makes it so much easier. Look ahead on the board. This is where so-and-so is going. Put that player to that pick. That's kind of a good way to gauge it, in my opinion. And another thing, like we mentioned earlier, Nate brought up a good point when we were doing one of these drafts earlier, is don't stick and rely to ADP, because in all honesty, that's where you can kind of do your homework and win the draft pretty quickly, is if you're not operating on ADP, because ADP is average draft position. You don't want to be average, right? You want to, be a little ahead of the ball. Don't be afraid to reach down the board a little. Don't be afraid to grab the guy that's next in ADP. You kind of got to make your own draft position ranking a little bit. Reach out to us in the Dynasty Rewind Patreon, patreon.com/Dynasty Rewind. Shout out. It's something that I think sadly comes down to kind of a gut feel too. But go back to, if you're sending, my golden rule of trading, if you're sending more assets than you're getting, it's probably not worth it anyway, especially in a startup draft. But moving on to kind of the last thing we'll touch on here, late round draft strategy, upside versus flex production. Are we targeting upside youth, productive veterans? Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts, Zach?
Depends on how late we're talking. I think in our example, our draft was about 25 rounds.
Yeah.
rounds 18 through 20, I'm looking at steals, players that other people didn't see. For example,
Sure.
I got David Njoku in the 18th round. I
Sure.
thought that was a little bit ridiculous
Yeah.
based on it being a tight end premium league. And then
Sure.
I'll look for stacks. So I drafted, I think, Harrison
Sure.
Bryant in the 22nd or 23rd round. I'll look for running back stacks, quarterback stacks. If you got Lamar Jackson, is Tyler Huntley there? The backup quarterback, is Jacoby Brissett there, who's going to potentially get a starting opportunity in Cleveland if Deshaun Watson's not able to play. I'll look for those type of situations. I think I picked up Austin Hooper in the 23rd round. I got 7 tight ends. Everyone's asking for my tight ends. I said, no, man, like that's a you problem now. Like,
That's a you problem, bud.
yeah, and
Yeah.
people slept
Know
on
your
the
league.
People slept on the tight ends in our league, and I'm just I was soaking up the tight end value in our at the end of the draft. So for me, that's I'm looking for those opportunities where there's players with immediate opportunity that just haven't been recognized. A player that's going to get an opportunity if one of your players goes down is what I'm doing.
I think a lot of it kind of does come down to how your team makeup goes up to that point. With me in my draft, I was able to kind of just I was able to still work on best player available, but I also targeted a lot of upside youth because I didn't feel like I needed productive veterans that are kind of declining assets that are still going to score points. I didn't really need that. I had enough to fill out a roster. Plus, I probably filled out 1.5 times my roster on my bench pretty easily. So wasn't really concerned with getting guys that could score points. More obsessed with kind of guys that could really break the mold. In terms of, that upside U swing. And I grabbed a couple tight ends too that fell.
Bob and I have our way of seeing things. You don't have to agree. What I would say is don't put yourself at a deficit in terms of draft assets for the future.
Sure.
You either do our strategy or just make your picks. I would not advocate for a situation where your team could suck and you don't have draft picks next year, because now you're just in a situation where you're unloading everything that you traded for, or you're standing pat and your team sucks because you have players that nobody wants and you don't have draft picks to improve that. So don't put yourself at a deficit in next year's draft, not because next year's draft is the sexiest thing, but people will covet those draft picks, whether you do or not. Other people will.
If you're not accustomed to trading in your startup draft, start slow. Move down once in a draft, move down another time in the next draft, and then just kind of exponentially work your way up to more moves. Because if you go into a draft guns blazing, being like, I'm trading down every pick, you'll be in the 10th round without making a draft pick. And then your team's going to be maybe really well set for the future, but you're going to be in rough shape for the now.
Right.
But, it's one of those things where, get comfortable with it. Don't go into a draft just trying to trade everything away. It is kind of a feel thing. Sadly, it does kind of come down to a gut feel. But how do you get a good gut feel? You practice. Do startup mock drafts. We do probably one a month here at the Dynasty Rewind with our Patreon team or our Discord group chats. Whatever drafts you can get in mock wise, have that. You don't necessarily need to start a league. And it's more about navigating the first 10, 12 rounds. And then if you can draft, productive veterans, make those youth upside decisions later, if you could really win your startup draft within the first 10 rounds. And then everything after that's kind of a plus, because that's a great spot that's a really good go get your guy territory, because it's a lot of, oh man, is so-and-so going to make it 10 picks later to me? Oh, well, you can trade down with me for it. I'll just take a 3rd round pick. It kind of scales as you trade down. You're getting less and less assets back. Don't go into it guns blazing to trade, because I think that's, Zach, how you get to that point of where you're going to end up at a deficit. Although if you're trading down, you definitely shouldn't end up at a deficit if you're doing it right. But again, it takes practice. It's not something set in stone or overly easy to do. Well, that is it for this video. I do hope you all enjoyed. Please leave a like if you did. Comment down below your thoughts on the video itself, our strategies. What are your draft strategies when it comes to a startup dynasty draft? If you want to support the team, check out patreon.com/Dynasty Rewind. We got all sorts of exclusive content over there to help you win and dominate your dynasty leagues, not to mention an amazing Discord community group chat. If you enjoyed this video, I do hope you take the time to check out this one, 10 tips for dynasty trading. I'll walk you through my top 10 tips plus a bonus tip for trading in Dynasty Fantasy Football. But hey, that is it from me today. I will see y'all in the next one. But until then, y'all have a good one.